All right, kia ora and good morning, everyone. I think we'll crack into it. We've got a few people on. Thanks so much for joining us again in one of our webinars that Infometrics is putting on for clients to, I guess, just outline how we see the economy still moving, but this time with a very keen focus on the 2020 budget that the Finance Minister, Grant Robertson, announced yesterday. My name is Brad Olsen. I'm a senior economist here at Infometrics, and I'll be sort of taking you through over the next wee bit. Looking to present again for around half an hour, although it might be a little bit earlier or quicker than that, and then very happy to take your questions. I mean, the budget in of itself was quite a huge package. I thoroughly enjoyed my 3.5 hours locked up with all of the other analysts and the journalists in the beehive yesterday to understand what was happening and to hear from the Finance Minister directly. I guess, still some concerns around where the country is going next and where some of those details might be at, but definitely a firm start there. So thanks so much for joining us. I do want to, I guess, throughout, I will share my screen and show you a few of the insights that we've pulled out. Only a limited number this time. I think, there's just so much detail that I wanted to take you through some of the key ones. What I did want to start with, though, just briefly, because we decided once we moved back to level 3 and then level 2, wasn't quite as much demand from people for our ongoing webinars. And to be honest, we didn't have a huge amount new every week to talk about. We wanted to make sure that instead we did something like this where there's a big topic to come in and chat to you guys. So I just want to give you a quick update on how we see the economy moving and some of the indicators, again, that we're able to be looking at the moment. I guess what has been sort of most fascinating in recent times is obviously we've now moved down out of level 3 back into level 2 over the last few days. I haven't quite got my haircut going yet, but that's definitely next on the cards when I find a bit of free time. There is this much different sort of issue that's at play under level 2. Under level 3, of course, businesses were trying to figure out how to operate and whether or not they could open. Under level 2, there's a lot more, a lot wider variety of places open. The real, I guess, issue becomes whether or not consumers are happy to get out there and spend. And certainly walking around in recent, over yesterday and today, there didn't seem to be as many people as I might have expected coming through over the next wee while. Now, I guess what I did want to show you, though, is that we are still seeing the economy start to improve. Some interesting insights from FlexiTime, who are a pay provider. They put out some quite useful insights on their website recently. I just wanted to highlight there that we are sort of seeing earnings tick back up. So it sort of implies, more people are returning to work. But it is still interesting that even over the last week, those earnings remain a lot lower than we might have expected, trading at around about 88% of pre-COVID levels. So still softer in many regards than we might have seen. As well as that, though, again, our primary sector is still doing very, very well. We continue to have our primary food-based exports that are in a good position. You can see here fruit still very much on the up, dairy as well, and meat just ever so slightly down, but still generally trading in a pretty firm position. Of course, some of our other manufactured goods are not needed as much across the world. We're not seeing as many of those coming through. That's the dark green line here. Similar for seafood and forestry. Seafood, of course, missed out a little bit in terms of its ability to trade during Chinese New Year. That's quite a big period for them. But in general, they are still in a softer position. Same sort of thing with forestry. Now, you can see there might be a little bit of a tick up, if you will, but volumes are still 80% down over the last 3 weeks compared to the same time in 2019. So still some very soft pieces of activity moving through there. But look, if we turn to the budget, that's the main topic. So let's sort of get into it. I guess what we saw yesterday in our minds was quite a comprehensive package from the government. It was, a really strong and a very different budget from any we've ever seen before. Of course, the centrepiece coming in with a $50 billion fund, the COVID response and rebuilding fund, recovery fund rather. Now, I guess important to recognise as well, I'm just trying to make sure I'm not in the sun here, that the likes of that $50 billion fund is not fully just not $50 billion. It's actually a little bit less than that. Now, that $50 billion includes the $10.7 billion that was allocated recently for some of the changes to the wage subsidy scheme, alongside the likes of the loan cashback scheme and similar. So when you hear 50, just tone that back a bit. From what we can work out, and certainly looking at Treasury's numbers, it's around about $20 billion worth of money that hasn't been allocated in yesterday's budget that Grant still has the ability to spend out over the next year or so. I mean, we got quite a nice document yesterday, the lovely blue cover. They decided not to go with a stock photo of some Kiwis who moved over to Australia like they did last year for their wellbeing budget. I guess what we have seen, though, is that from a fiscal side, and look, let's deal with that one for a moment. There was a lot of spending made, and in our mind, some quite strong first moves, if you will, to get the economy moving again. In many respects, though, it's not. I don't know if I would term it a rebuilding budget. I think it's still a response budget in many forms. There were a lot of announcements that came through, but there wasn't a firm sort of plan for where we go to from here. Now, don't get me wrong, that's not really a criticism. In fact, if we had come up with a really comprehensive plan yesterday, I would have been even more concerned, because the economy is still groaning and creaking. It's still readjusting to this COVID-19 pandemic. And so with all of those changes, yesterday, I guess, laid the foundation for that recovery, but also kept the lights on for as long as possible. Key announcement, if you will, yesterday, that $3.2 billion for the wage subsidy extension. Now, some changes coming through to that, of course, upping the requirement to 50% revenue decline in a slightly shorter period of time, only 8 weeks, I think it was, that you can get paid for instead of the 12 that the original scheme covers. Now, the interesting element with that is that it essentially, again, just pushes out when we might see people laid off, and that is a good thing. By the time we get to the end of the second extension, or this extension we've got to the wage subsidy package, we're getting sort of into spring and starting to think a little bit about summer. And that's quite positive from a business sentiment point of view. New Zealand winters are sometimes a bit miserable, no more so than somewhere like here in Wellington. As we move through, though, that will see more people supported in jobs. And those elements will, I guess, keep businesses ticking over. So in our minds, a very smart move. What that package also does, though, is it does give a bit more of a time-limited element to it. We can't just have an open-ended wage subsidy moving forward, because there are going to be some big transitions that need to be had. What these schemes do, though, is keep people employed for a bit longer. It lets us weather that storm. It keeps more people in jobs, and that's quite an important focus there. Now, I mean, jobs was the big word yesterday. There was a huge amount of focus on it. And I guess, it was everything from trying to keep the jobs we've got with the likes of the wage subsidy, finding new ones, for example, with the $1.1 billion announced for looking after our environment, but also getting 11,000 Kiwis into work. Now, the interesting thing there is if you divide that 1.1 billion by the 11,000 workers, you get 100,000 per job, which is an interesting figure, is probably the only comment I'll make there. But certainly, government is pumping out a lot of money in that regard. The other opportunities, I guess, the government saw was how to try and, I guess, kill two birds with one stone as it went through the COVID-19 pandemic response and recovery fund, essentially where they could invest money to both get jobs, but also to get some sort of other return. And I think the government took a lot of those opportunities as it moved forward. For example, there was an announcement around, additional healthcare spending. Now that keeps more people in work, of course. It also starts to build up or eat into, rather, some of the underfunding that some of our government agencies have, and certainly people in the private sector have felt built up in the health sector over recent years. At the same time, we had the announcement around the 8,000 additional state houses that the government is looking to bring in. Now, important to recognise, last Thursday, our chief forecaster here at Infometrics, Gareth Kernan, did note and put out a release around how that importance of state housing, both to prop up the construction sector, but also to start supporting as many of our vulnerable families, rather, as possible as we move through this. We know that people are already in very hard financial times, and that's only about to get worse as we continue through this pandemic and the economic downturn we're likely to see. That state housing has a real key focus on making some of those changes to people's lives. The other thing, of course, is that with that state housing, that 8,000 additional homes, we would probably like to see more in some respects. The construction sector is going to be in a very hard place moving forward with not as much building activity going on. And state houses provide a really key aspect to keeping more of our residential construction workforce going. Now, at the same time, you've also got these huge housing pressures we've had in recent years. And by our calculations, even if the government was to build 9,400 homes over the next 2 years, and that's compared to 8,000 over, I think, 5 years that they announced yesterday, that would still only get our state housing, our housing register, the social housing need, if you will, in New Zealand, we'd only get that back down to 2014-15 levels before it started to tick up quite quickly. So again, more needing to be done, but a very, very firm first start. One of the more interesting / concerning areas coming out of the budget yesterday was the $3 billion announced for infrastructure. Now, I say concerning in the sense that, according to the government's reports, government's been submitted anywhere between upwards of $130 billion worth of projects for possible shovel-ready status that can get moving soon. Yet they've only allocated $3 billion so far, and I sort of the maths concerns me a little bit there in terms of how quickly the government might be able to get its activity going and actually do it at any scale that can, maintain and aid the construction sector as we move forward. Some big challenges coming through there. The other concern I, of course, had was the mention of sort of the continued actions of the Provincial Growth Fund in its current form. And if the speed of the PGF is what we're going to have for the COVID-19 COVID-19 activities, I do wonder if the economy craters much quicker, in the sense that the PGF has been incredibly slow to spend out. And there is a concern that if that slow spending activity remains, that the government just doesn't get that recovery going as quickly, and that sort of stymies the entire economy as we move forward. So again, some concerns, if you will, around some of those sort of elements. The last bit, and if you will, probably the most critical though, is that additional funding we had coming through for the likes of the education sector. 1.6 billion for some of the training elements that go through there, both training for sort of new people who are looking for further education, but also retraining coming through for those who have lost their jobs during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I guess that retraining element is going to be really critical, and some key successes are going to need to happen to enable us to get Kiwis back into work. It was useful and important to hear yesterday the funding approved for the Workforce Development Councils, the WDCs, and the regional skills leadership groups as well, to make sure that as we do go through this pandemic, as we do have to focus on what other jobs are necessary, we have those groups who are able to allocate, able to work with industries, work with educators to understand where to best sort of put people, what areas are likely to grow and where they need to best resource our education. The great thing as well was that sort of trades and apprenticeship training. Now, certainly in New Zealand over recent years, there's this sort of odd obsession with university being the be-all and end-all of tertiary education. I went to Whangarei Boys High up in the north, and that was very much talking to all of my friends around the country. At high school, university is the natural progression, if you will. And I think that's a real issue here in New Zealand, is that actually we need to be much more open about the very high quality and important elements of some of our polytechnics, of our trades providers, of our apprenticeships. And those things often don't come through. So it was useful to hear the government yesterday pump some serious money into those programs to get people moving again, to get that spending and such happening. Now, I do want to, though, turn to some of how the government is looking to shape up, both in terms of what their books are likely to be looking like, but also some of those other elements around the economy. And I just want to share my screen again and run through some of those elements there. I guess the first one is Treasury's expectations for the economy. And look, it's a point that we've done in a number of webinars, but I will reiterate the point around what does the actual shape of recovery look like. Now, you can see here with two of the three budget scenarios that they've come up with. One, the central blue scenario, and that black line there coming through with, if they examine what happens if the entire $50 billion fund is utilised. Again, you can see that the level of activity, if you will, comes back by sort of the end of 2021, start of 2022 in terms of nominal GDP activity. So again, very, very fast recovery. Essentially, Treasury says within a year and, 2.5 years, economy's fine. Everything is sort of back towards normal. And I really struggle sometimes around just how optimistic some of those views look. Now, to be clear, the Reserve Bank has got a very similar looking projection as its central view, this sort of, swift upturn. And I guess my concern is that if we have those big structural readjustments coming into the economy, those changes are likely to see our economy, I guess, re-gear or retool itself for a much longer period. We don't just bounce back to normal because that normal doesn't exist, and it takes a bit more time for us to find that new equilibrium position. So in my mind, that green line you can see on the slide that I've shared, the slower recovery element from Treasury is much more likely and much more in keeping with our own forecasts. Now, of course, the likes of that slower recovery are looking a little bit more U-shaped. I mean, growth rates are always a little bit harder to make look like letters, but that green is looking more like what we'd call a U-shaped recovery than the V-shape that you can see coming through a lot clearer for those other two scenarios there. There's just been a question, and I will answer it quickly around, is a W not considered possible? Look, a W is definitely still in play. I guess our expectation at the moment, or our hope, if you will, is that we still have this sort of the ability to bounce back and sort of stay on the path. Whether or not it's a longer or a faster bounce back is the question we're looking at. I guess the concern, if you will, that does start to emerge, and I note this as only a wider concern, not something I actually expect to happen. But of course, if we did have a second wave of the COVID-19 pandemic that rips through New Zealand, or in fact any of our trading partners, that would have some severe economic implications as well. And it's worth remembering that back in the 1918 Spanish flu, we did have a few waves coming through. In fact, I think the second and third waves were considerably worse than the first wave ever looked like. So a risk, if you will, that if we did have another few waves of COVID-19 come through, there would be some severe economic implications for that. And that would certainly see the likes of a W looking a little bit more likely, especially if we had to go back down to level 3 or similar. Now, look, the government is having to find a way to fund this $50 billion it's taking out, and that is going to be through debt. Essentially, the government is now taking out a mortgage against the New Zealand economy, and that is the right thing to do, but it is still quite a painful exercise. Borrowing costs for the government are very low, and it makes sense that now is the time to invest. I guess the other alternative is what we saw back in the 1930s during the Great Depression, which was where governments were sort of undergoing austerity. They cut back funding, and actually that exacerbated the downturn and left it going much, much longer. It took us really until the Second World War came through to really pump up demand and activity. So debt is not particularly fun, I guess, and certainly not the sort of element you'd want to always be getting into, but it is, the most prudent course of action. Now, of course, worth pointing out that under most of these scenarios, we're still trending to above 50% of debt to GDP. Now, worth noting, I guess, 2 points with this. What we're essentially seeing with that is, one, a reduction in the likes of our actual earnings, so and our output. So that GDP number comes down quite steeply. At the same time, though, we've got this sort of increase in debt, and I think in terms of actual numbers, $200 billion worth of debt is what we're likely to see coming through in the economy over the next sort of 5 years or so. So a considerable amount of loans activity that moves through. That does put the government's books in quite a bad shape as we move forward. But again, it's sort of the best option, if you will. We do have to borrow to get out of this. And at the moment, it is, I guess, cheap, and it is the right move. The one concern, I guess, is how we pay this back over time. Now, the latest numbers out from MSD continue to indicate that young people are facing the greatest number of job losses across the economy. Those increases in youth unemployment are certainly of concern, particularly when we look at who is going to repay this debt over time, and it will fall proportionately more on our younger generation. I guess I'm just wary of us sort of saddling up young people. I include myself in that category, up with more debt at the same time as, they're already in a very vulnerable financial situation. I think what the government will have to consider in future years is what is that repayment path and what are the options available to government. And there's been a lot of talk, and I think very important talk, that now is not the time for tax reforms, but they are going to have to come back on the table at some point, and we are going to have to consider some of our other sacred cows that we often hold dear. Can we continue to have NZ Super in the way it's currently set up? Can we continue without a capital gains tax? Essentially, with the quite vast reorientation of the economy, we are going to have to decide how we reinvigorate our own funding models as well. So I guess just flagging, there are still changes likely on the horizon there. The other one just to pick up on, and it reiterates that concern around the labour market, is the lower earnings that Treasury expects to come through. And so you can see here, if we look at the amount of earnings, we're talking a few $1 billion shaved off the economy each year in terms of the amount of tax earnings that the government brings in. Now, of course, that means that the government books go even deeper into the red. I think we're talking deficits of sort of 29-30 billion for the next 3-4 years before we start to turn things a bit more around. Again, considerably worse than the likes of the global financial crisis, but also worse than I guess we've ever expected it would go. Those debt tracks going higher alongside those lower earnings do hit the government's books quite considerably. Now, those lower earnings, I guess, are indicative of that lower ability to spend that Kiwis have out there. What we have started to hear is it's not just that New Zealanders are losing jobs. We're also hearing of sort of pay cuts for a limited period of time, but those periods of time seem to get longer and longer. At the same time, people are losing the amount of hours they'd normally be allocated. Again, sort of all reducing household incomes, making it a much, much harder place to move forward. Now, the government did yesterday, I guess, implicitly rule out helicopter money anytime soon. The finance minister making it quite clear that wasn't something that was too close to the top of the pile for the remaining 20 billion. And Winston Peters, the Deputy Prime Minister, also making it relatively abundantly clear in many respects that that wasn't something on the table. So I guess a bit of a different concern coming through there for households as to how exactly they're going to navigate this downturn. We do still need to see at some point an injection into households to get them moving again, but what and sort of when that will shape up is sort of yet to be determined. The final point, and I guess the last area I sort of want to touch on here is as we move through, we've seen a lot of support coming through for workers and jobs, and I think that's important. What we didn't see as much yesterday, and I was a bit disappointed in some respects, was that lack of sort of business support. We know that talking to businesses out there, they continue to have a range of issues. Cash flows are still not particularly rosy, and again, the amount of money that people are having to spend on their fixed costs and similar is often, sizable compared to the amount of revenue they might be bringing in. And I guess one of the concerns as we move to level 2 is out there in the economy, it does seem to still be slower than we might expect. Fewer people out and about, less spending that might be going on. At the same time, we've got the raised costs that businesses are having to wear around, PPE that they've had to buy, and some of the other distancing measures that is all sort of costing them money as we move through this. So I guess just worthwhile noting some of those concerns that we have around where we go to next. The good thing, I guess the main point I do want to leave you with though, before I start to take some of the questions that have emerged through, is that the government has left that $20 billion unallocated so it can watch how the economy develops and then spend it in the appropriate place. So Grant's made quite a smart move there as Finance Minister to give himself a bit of wriggle room, a bit of that ability to decide on what the best spending mechanisms are going into the future. Also means he can wait and see for a few months how the business sector shapes up, how the economy starts to move, and then start to target additional stimulus and additional funding for different areas. So those are most of my opening remarks. I'm just going to have a look here at some of your questions and start to go through some of them. And so we've got a question coming in from Philip around Crown Infrastructure Partners and the announcement of sort of funding that they've got. Look, My understanding there is that CIP haven't yet made full allocations of where their funding might be, and haven't decided how much is going to come through. I think what we saw yesterday from government was that additional 3 billion or so coming through for infrastructure seemed to be a little bit untagged in a sense, and I suspect that's hopefully the only starting point in the bucket to get stuff moving. Of course, I think what we are going to have to require across the country is a much more regionally focused infrastructure approach. And the likes of Northland and certainly maybe parts of the Waikato and the Bay of Plenty, who are in drought at the moment, additional water storage capacity is obviously a bit of a no-brainer to make sure they can continue to remain viable communities as we move throughout times. That's something that a lot of places have already been calling for quite a lot prior to COVID-19, but does give an insight into the need coming through there. Of course, in the north as well, they're looking at additional investments around, a dry dock, additional roading and rail capacity, as well as marine facilities for their port. And I think, those sort of campaigns will continue to ramp up as the government has quite clearly signalled it has money, and it will be looking for where it can best invest. And again, I suspect those sort of projects will come through quite clearly. Across the country, I do think there's going to be a need for additional infrastructure investment in our waterways, in our water assets, both to protect our waterways, but also to ensure that we have access still to clean drinking water, as well as the ability to move our wastewater out in a safe and convenient manner. That's, of course, an area that isn't particularly sexy, if you will. Everyone always talks about, you can sort of see roads and they're a very visible sign of construction and activity. Water assets aren't quite as important. But as I think Wellington has demonstrated earlier this year, that when you do have an issue with water, you have to close off an entire street and similar, it does have quite major implications for the economy as well. So important that we get some of that stuff done a little bit more as we move forward. So thanks for that one, Philip, and I hope that gave you a bit more insight. Essentially, from our understanding, there hasn't been the same amount of announcement coming through yet. Ministers, I suspect, will still be looking at where they want to best invest. Please keep the questions coming through as well. I'll sort of keep going through there. A question coming through from Andrew around concerns or criticisms around the new Polytech structure. This will be the New Zealand Institute of Skills and Technology, I suspect he's referring to, and the ability to cope or contend with additional requirements that is now going to be placed on trades training. Any comments on that? Look, I guess in general, the focus of the reinvigoration or changes coming through in the education sector were always necessary. There may well be, I guess, teething issues in the front end, but there are already a number of sort of pre-existing issues that I think the new system will allow us to be a little bit more nimble towards. Sure, there's sort of that setup cost and that setup element we're going to have to grapple with. But as we move forward, I do think that it actually shows a bit more promise, particularly because of that real regional focus that we see coming through there. There is now a national body, don't get me wrong, but that focus with regional skills leadership groups and workforce development councils means that we are able to start better targeting how we might want to address some of these issues, how we get the right people into the right jobs, how we make sure that in fact that there are going to be jobs where there is training to be done. All of those elements in my mind will be quite important. I guess the truth, or the proof rather, will be in the pudding in terms of how our regional areas sort of stand up. And I know there's already a number of areas that are sort of well progressed, if you will, with regional skills leadership groups or similar, to make sure that they are best prepared, that when they get that funding, when they get operational to the fullest extent, they're able to move quite quickly, work in with local industry leaders, with local educators, with local community groups to best enable that sort of employment market shock to really get people back into work. So I think, look, there's always going to be criticism about some of these readjustments, but in my mind, it's actually quite a good move, and it provides us with a bit more of a focus moving forward. It probably does also outline, though, that in the wider education space, we really do need to reconsider what that funding profile, what that funding envelope and the way we fund it will move. In terms of, sorry, I've just had a question here. I thought I'd grab a glass of water in the middle of it, around our PGF spending expectations and a question there from Jared around those figures. And I guess we put out a release a few weeks back. I'm not 100% sure off the top of my head, Jared, but I will get back to you around what that actual figure is. I'm pretty sure it was pretty low, and my expectations would be, I think off the top of my head, it was around about 16% of spending that the PGF has allocated. So, there's been a huge amount of announcements from different ministers across the country, a lot of press conferences, a lot of sort of stand-ups. But the actual money that's come out of that, I'm pretty sure it's less than 20% of the actual allocated. So we've heard a lot of, I guess, announcements, but very, very little actual action. And in fact, a lot of the money that we saw in the early days of the PGF probably didn't make it into the regions anyway. It made it into consultants' hands to do some of our those sort of pre-evaluations, business cases and other sort of reports and documentation. So again, the actual ability or the spending that's gone on in some of our local areas is a little bit more restricted than we might have otherwise hoped. A question here around sort of some of the structures that the government is looking at in terms of we haven't seen any big changes yet. And sort of some of the areas I noted are superannuation, maybe energy and climate, and that question from Alistair around if that's being held over for the second term. Alistair, I suspect you're probably right. Now is just not the time to come through with those structural changes. And I guess there's a fear that if we go too early, that we start making or baking in decisions that may well turn out to not be the best move. Let's be clear, we don't actually know at the moment what sort of jobs have been lost around the country, what industries they're in, who has lost those jobs, but also what might grow in the future. And that's a concern from a data point of view, if you will, but also a wider concern around if we start to make too much of a solid plan at the moment and the actual events don't bear out the way we'd planned them to, then we may well have a plan that shoots off in this direction when the economy is actually on a very different path. So in some respects, I think what we saw yesterday from the budget was sort of setting down that foundation so that we have a solid footing to jump off. We haven't made some of those big structural changes yet. I think the likes of superannuation changes, even some of our tax and transfer policy settings, it's a bit premature to do that. At the moment, if we had any of those big changes through, that would disincentivize or it would cause some major disruptions at a time when there's already enough disruption coming through. Any changes to tax, to the settings of how we sort of, incentivize how businesses operate would only sort of serve to cause it for a bit more confusion at the moment. And so I think the government sort of said, look, we'll put some money out the door, we'll get the economy cranking a bit more. Once we start to think more about that full rebuilding phase, that's, I think, where the government will start to take a bit more of a look at where it needs to start investing and what big structural changes it might want to sort of take under its wing and go forward with. Obviously, the likes of climate activity is quite a key area as we move through this. It's going to be something the government wants to focus on quite keenly to make sure when it is investing and it is deciding on where the money goes next, that there is a good rationale behind it, and it meets not only the economic test but also some of the social and environmental tests that we know Kiwis care about. I guess that the other issue as we look at that is, in my mind, there's a real need for smarter thinking around how we best enable the likes of our primary sector. We know that in recent times they've been thrown or hit rather with quite a large stick, told that they need to sort of clean up our waterways and similar. And I think it's at the moment we're understanding a lot more as a country just how important our agriculture sector is to the economy, as it is to keeping people in jobs. And in my mind, we could well and should well offer more of a carrot to those agricultural sectors, to our primary based activities, so that they can get on top of some of the environmental concerns we have. Those are undeniable, but to be clear, they're also not just because of farmers or anything stupid like that. Our urban centres are in some ways just as bad, and obviously there's elements of change we need to bring in there. I'd like to see the government come through with greater investment around some of those incentive changes, so that instead of sort of telling people off and saying they're doing the wrong thing, to give them the incentive, the ability to redefine how they do business, how they drive around the local area, to incentivize them to have a bit more of an environmentally focused element as we move through this. The question here from Greg around if the Treasury forecasts for unemployment factor in that stimulus package, or if they were done as a baseline before some of the investment. Look, Treasury has, I guess, had quite a hard and tough task in recent weeks. The forecast for some of them were signed off as early as sort of mid-April, I think. Mid-April. As I guess the government has continued to develop its thinking, there's been some quite rapid changes that have come through. In fact, some of the major budget packages, I think around the likes of that 1.6 billion for education, were only agreed by Cabinet on Monday this week. Now, in any normal cycle, that's completely never included in the budget. What the government has done with its scenarios there, though, Greg, is that central scenario I showed you with the blue line. I might actually just go back to my slide very briefly. With this one here, you can see in this one, essentially the budget update, the blue line there, and it will be similar for their unemployment expectations, is essentially that blue line says or looks at how the economy might develop under the sort of the scenario as the Treasury knew it back in mid-April. That black line with the full fund utilised is probably incorporates a lot more of the government's sort of new activities that it announced at budget yesterday. So in my mind, it's still optimistic, but they do start to bring in some of those nuances around how much of the funding is actually utilised or not there. There was a question around the assessment of the budget allocations for Māori and Māori business and where are the gaps. Look, I think Māori got a very strong increase coming through from the budget yesterday. Certainly that's what I've been hearing from those who are a bit closer to the action than myself. I guess what emerges as a key concern again as we move forward is what are those ways to get businesses moving, to get people to invest. And I think we've seen a lot around sort of social settings, around support for education, those other elements, and that's critical, don't get me wrong. I think there is still that need for actual support for businesses. What I'd like to see, for example, is there was a rollout yesterday or an expansion in some of the advice that was coming through for businesses across the country, and a bit more of a focus from NZTE to support our exporters. I'd really like to see, a Māori business development sort of network emerge that has support coming through from government to get some of that advice around how Māori businesses are faring, and also some of the ideas they have to better enable other businesses to pick up those ideas and run with them. I'm sure there's already some activities in that network, but I dare suspect we might need a bit more coming through in that regard. There's a question around sort of the borders and the lack of investment or announcement around smart borders and some of the changes coming through for the tourism sector. I guess that is quite a concern and one that, look, I think our borders and tourism and that sort of general international picture is one that we're having to grapple with quite a lot, and there again remains incredible uncertainty. One of the things, just to sort of, context-wise, is that the Treasury is picking that the borders are open relatively swiftly within the next year or two. And I can understand that for something like Australia, but for a lot of our other trading partners, I'd really feel like we need to wait until a vaccine comes through. And every indication from every expert across the world seems to make it clear that if we get a vaccine at any time in the next 2 years, that'll be significantly faster than any other sort of vaccine we've ever sort of managed to conjure up before. So some real interesting elements in terms of the assumptions we might be making. Now, I think what I was disappointed with, Susan, to address your question, was that the sort of element of how we can get the borders back open in some way, shape or form was a little bit lacking. We obviously didn't hear anything about education, international education, in terms of could we bring in people with some sort of limited, quarantine period or similar. The universities and other educators have been working quite hard to understand how they can best, come up with a plan and submit that to government. Nothing really announced there yesterday. At the same time, of course, for tourism, trying to understand how quickly we can open our borders and who to will be important. And you're right to point out that we didn't have an announcement yesterday. And I suspect that will be one of the greatest issues the government and cabinet has to grapple with, is what is the right time to open the borders? And if they do start to open them, what are the criteria that they have to start operating under? There's a question here around sort of whether or not we might be likely to see any of that $20 billion come through. That's the unallocated $20 billion, just to be clear, coming through as support for additional benefit stimulus and similar. I think one of the omissions, if you will, coming through from the budget yesterday was there wasn't a huge amount more for those who are sort of being turfed out of work and having to go on the job seeker benefit. Now, important to recognise over the last 5 or 6 weeks, we've had 40,000 Kiwis, and there'll be more that will have been reported at some point earlier today, I suspect, who've now gone on to the job seeker benefit. You know, that is a huge amount of people that we are no longer able to have an employment and are now reliant on the state. I guess as we examine that, and we do note that back in, I think, March, must have been, we did have the government that announced a 25% rather per week increase to all main benefits, as well as, and that's on an ongoing basis, as well as just for this year alone, a doubling of the winter energy payment. Now, I do wonder if the government will continue to remain under considerable pressure to spend more on these areas to increase benefits further or provide additional stimulus through to households. I guess what I'd also like to consider is how we can support those who are still working but remain on some of our lower incomes around some of those thresholds. Of course, the conversation being whether or not we need to extend or modify the Working for Families system to better enable additional support to those on lower incomes. I think we will, though, see continued focus or continued pressure on where that sort of social sector spending goes. Of course, the number of people on job seeker support is going to skyrocket significantly. Of course, all of those elements will mean the government comes under more pressure. Now, when we did invent the welfare state that we sort of have in some way, shape or form today, that did come through in the wake of the Great Depression of the 1930s. So we're in a similar position. The last time we were in this much of an economic hole, we reimagined or found a new way to deliver services and support to people. I do wonder if we will see a similar sort of redefinition at some point soon. Now, I don't know if that will be sort of soon in terms of the next few months or soon as in the next few years. I suspect probably more the latter, just as the government tries to grapple with where it is best to put its money. I guess that does take me to a separate point. I'll get back to the questions in a moment, but it's an interesting element of where we're spending in and if it's the most appropriate area. Now, of course, we've wanted to make it quite clear that the government picking sort of sole winners as we move through is not going to be the best idea as the sort of the economy starts to redefine itself. It doesn't seem to have stopped some quarters trying to get additional investment, though, with $72 billion announced for the likes of the racing industry prior. Now, I know there are a lot of sector groups that have interest in additional funding in that, but I think that the publicity of that racing announcement probably irked quite a few people who saw there to be a number of other sectors who haven't seen any or nearly enough support coming through from the government. Now, tourism, of course, got, I think it was 400 million yesterday as part of a wider package. But if you look at the likes of the hospitality sector, who are still struggling, finding it very, very difficult as we move through, they can't be open for another week if they're a bar to start with. But as well as that, there's been very little movement from the government to assist hospitality, even when there's been some quite common sense recommendations put to them, particularly around the likes of alcohol sales and similar. So I think trying to pick winners is going to be the government's biggest downfall. It sort of needs to make sure that when it is spending, that spending goes out far and wide, and to a degree that we let businesses get on with being a primary determinant of how the economy moves, rather than just letting the government become sort of the big state and taking over, if you will, in some degrees. There's a question coming in here around whether or not we might have, yesterday's announcements might readjust our sort of forecast for construction activity and similar, and whether or not those are going to change. I guess the main point there is that we'd already sort of anticipated parts of this. We sort of didn't specifically say, well, we will get $3 billion for infrastructure, for example, but we did implicitly have allowed in our forecast for additional infrastructure investment because the government sort of had to. Otherwise, we would have had to allow the unemployment rate to skyrocket far higher and see much more subdued activity. So we're, at the moment, I don't think we've made too much of an adjustment to our expectations around our forecasts. Once we've sort of seen a bit more data from how level 2 is starting to track, I think that's when we'll start to really reevaluate our forecast with a lot more clarity and a lot more information. The other point, of course, is that one of the key triggers, if you will be in the middle of August when we start to get a better read on what job losses have occurred and what areas and what industries. That's going to be a critical one for us to understand where is that sort of new level of economic activity, what are some of the industry changes likely to be as we move through that. The final part of this question from this person, though, I'll pick up on as well, and that was the Reserve Bank's announcement on Wednesday that they will double their quantitative easing program to around about $60 billion, but they won't be changing the official cash rate anytime soon. Now, a few things to unpack there. The first one, let's go with the QE stuff first. Of course, what essentially the Reserve Bank is looking to do is to continue to hold longer term interest rates much lower. Those transfer on to retail banks who give everyone their mortgage and other loan facilities. And it's essentially just trying to keep that lending level, that repayment level, that interest rate as low as possible for as long as possible, so that people can continue to loan with confidence, and also so that they have that ability to do it on the cheap. Trying to roll over loans and similar while interest rates go higher would see the businesses having to spend a lot less on other areas, so just trying to keep that lending availability and lending cost as low as possible. On the official cash rate, really interesting there that back in March when the Reserve Bank made an emergency 75 basis point cut, they made it quite clear they were issuing what we talk about as forward guidance. They said, we won't move the official cash rate for a year. That's what we're telling you as the market. This time around, they made it clear that actually the reason they weren't going to do any sorts of cuts to the official cash rate this time around was because they simply couldn't. The retail bank systems aren't quite ready for a negative interest rate yet, but the Reserve Bank has made it clear that it expects retail banks should be ready for a negative cash rate if the Monetary Policy Committee so decides to do it when they by the end of this year. And I guess that's one of sort of the key elements as we move through this is trying to decipher what the Reserve Bank views its role to be and sort of how much it will still get involved in the market or not. Will it remain sort of in the secondary market? Will it decide to buy bonds directly off the government? Those are some of the things we'll wait and see. But our expectation is that monetary policy settings probably still need to go lower. The additional quantitative easing funding will likely, I guess, provide or contribute towards that lower or much more accommodative monetary policy. At the same time, I would expect that the official cash rate probably does need to be cut again into negative territory, like we've seen in overseas jurisdictions at some point soon. And I think that we'll see that possibly towards the end of the year, very early next year, if things don't sort of materially start to recover. There was a question here around the announcements of sort of greenlighting a bit more or trying to get entrepreneurial activity moving in a faster direction. And I guess it was coming through a lot more in terms of how do we get existing firms moving and not as much sort of startups or new ventures. I guess that comes to one of the points that we made in the media here at Infometrics a little bit prior to the budget coming in. And that was basically around how we best get new businesses operating. Once we are through the worst of COVID-19, we do want to see new businesses pop up. But if businesses remain in a very, very risk-adverse environment, the uncertainty that might persist in normal times would sort of see businesses who don't want to start up or don't want to sort of take their venture public yet. I guess one of the areas that we'd like to see is the government consider, grants to new startups, and actually there's two policies here. The first one is looking at grants for new startups, getting some money to those new entities to essentially get over that risk hurdle, to take a bit of a go on the economy, to give it a crack without the same sort of risk that just being sort of a private holder would normally have you do. The other area, of course, is sort of a second chance loan or a second chance recovery, if you will. Some of our businesses that we see out there in the economy at the moment are not going to be able to continue operating in the way they have done as the economy continues to evolve. They'll need to pivot and redefine themselves. And again, I wonder if the government coming out with some grants to allow them to redefine themselves, to invest a bit more in that sort of that new look of the business could be quite important to get businesses moving again, to get more people in employment, to get the cash flowing back through the economy. The risk, I guess, is that we have what we are currently focused on, and that is very much a sort of a debt loading of businesses where the only support seems to often be support, obviously, in terms of cash for employees, but on the employer side, as they try to grapple with their costs, it's only really that the people can take out a loan from their bank or the government, or the bank and the government combined. Those elements there, I guess, are the things that are a bit concerning from a business point of view, and I would like to see some additional support brought in there for the likes of our businesses to actually re-up themselves. There was a question around the budget expenditure figures and sort of what we might have been looking at in terms of our GDP and job predictions. Look, like we haven't had a time to sort of go through them. I must say, Budget Day was a rather chaotic one yesterday with some very different protocols, Daryl, but we will be looking into those and I guess adjusting our expectations as we move through. Like I did say, though, when we looked on the face of it at both the Reserve Bank but also the Treasury's projections, I think the near term, the next year, is sort of, we're all operating with a fair bit of lacking information, so we're making our best assessment of it. And they're all in the right direction. I guess it is over that longer period of time where we still see quite a severe divergence between our expectations and the likes of Treasury and the Reserve Bank. And look, to be clear, when talking to people, from Treasury and knowing, a little bit about how their modelling is likely to work, I think we've had to sort of specifically adjust down our assessments in further years to account for our expectation for lower growth, but also to account for that structural sort of shift in the economy. You've got to remember that generally when economists do this, there's sort of this long-term reversion to mean. We want to get back to a normal level of activity over a certain period of time. And if you cut out a whole chunk of activity in 1 year, the model will try and force it back towards a new normal of level, a new level of normal over time. And that means that sort of the bump up is sort of just as large. So in some respects, we've had to temper our expectations still down a little bit on that. There was a question around from someone around what sort of budget this was, and I would note that we have again, if we look at it, it is called a well-being budget, but in many respects, this comment's quite right around. It seems to be a little bit more of an abandonment of the well-being focus, and I guess demonstrates as well that in most frames, the budget of this year and even last were not pure well-being budgets. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think to examine them as pure wellbeing budgets is a little bit losing the focus. In essence, we have seen that the government comes quite clearly here to focus on jobs and on employment, and I guess that speaks to what the Prime Minister noted a few days before, where essentially the government came out and said we've sort of cut the priorities that we previously had. And in my mind, that says that wellbeing was never the front and centre piece of the government's sort of economic plank, if you will. It was much more nice to have on the periphery, or certainly wasn't conceptualised the same way the government might have been talking about it. Well-being during a downturn is just as important as well-being during the best of times. In fact, if we make sure that we've got people who are in work, who can access the right services across the country in terms of health, in terms of education and training, they're able to participate in their communities. All of those things are just as beneficial for what we term well-being as for GDP over the long. All right, I'm back. Sorry, everyone, for that. I'm not quite sure what happened there. I think it's what happens when Zoom decides to restart itself or something happens on my computer. Apologies very much for that. I'm trying to remember where I was in the middle of that conversation. Nope, I've completely lost it. But please feel free to throw a few more comments or questions in there. We are getting quite close to time. We've gone through quite a few of them there. I don't see too many more that I haven't made my way to. And so what I might do there, to be honest, I think we might close it up there. I suspect a few people might have jumped off when my face decided to roll away. So look, thanks so much for coming along. I hope it has been useful for you all just to gain a bit more of an understanding of how we see the budget coming out, some of the key movers and policy announcements and what they might mean for the economy, and I guess some of the areas to continue to be a little bit more circumspect about as we move through this COVID-19 pandemic, as we reevaluate where the economy is moving from here. We'll make sure a copy of this recording is put up on the website at some point over the weekend. If you do have any questions, please feel free to get in touch with us. I'm always happy to chat, although I must say the email inbox fills up much faster than it normally has done. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you all next time. Kia ora.